yourself.
There's been several variants that we've talked about in the past, that for the most part didn't make the cut for either being good or at least fun to use. And as we've seen in past patches such as 4.10, there's always the possibility of improving upon the already established abilities. As of now, there's a fair share of variants that could use some form of buff in a future patch. Obviously the devs don't need to follow anything about to spew, and there's things that much prioritize over buffing variants at the moment.
Rift battles at the moment are
Shut the fuck up!
But still, I want to discuss some of the currently lesser good variants, and how I would go about making them better. Now I have to set a few conditions, first one being one variant per character. There are cases where several of them would need changes, but I'll limit myself to going with one regardless, and justify why if necessary. On the other hand, there are some characters that at the moment I consider none of their variants really require any buffs, these being Squiggly, Misfortune and Valentine, which before you comment what about Scared Stiff. Second, we'll be reducing the discussion of bronzes and exclusives as much as possible, because they're either expected or excusable for them to be bad, or the flex value compensates for a lackluster ability. Third and most important, not all the buffs have to be geared towards the meta-centric play, mostly on the principle that while it'd be cool everything had a niche in Rift battles, it's simply not the case. Therefore some of the buffs will be similar to that of Dead Heat, for example, where they're not necessarily game-changing improvements, but enough to make them more worthwhile. Last would be no umbrellas. I know I've been skipping her for a long while by now, but trust me, patience will make it worth it eventually. No, it won't. Parasite Weave has lost a lot of ground over the years, starting off initially as a ridiculously broken variant that could effectively stun-lock the opponent, to then become a shadow of her former self and now having no value whatsoever. Regardless of the nostalgia I have for the old ability, bringing it back would still snap the game in half, because you rendered the enemy completely defenseless. In theory. But I digress. That being said, the devs did keep the stun aspect to some degree, so perhaps it's best to leave it untouched, alongside the bleed. The biggest offender is by far slow as the debuff which prevents the stun lock. Not because of the reason why it's there, but rather a singular slow stack does basically nothing. An easy solution to this would be replacing it with a much more practical debuff. Some options would include Armor Break, Heal Block, Curse or Wither, although Armor Break is already taken by Bad Miss Frosty, and to some degree Idle Threat. Heal Block could work as a passable fit, but it's also claimed by the likes of Glass Cutter. As for Curse, it would combine well, but perhaps a little too well, thanks to matching perfectly with Bleed and being a great debuff in general. Wither would be a good fit due to fulfilling Slow's role for meter control much better, but would still render Parasite not that worth investing. Of course, it could be possible for her to inflict 2 stacks at once, which while still making her not 100% essential, it would at least improve her significantly. Between Armed Forces and Brain Freeze, people generally consider the latter to be the lesser good variant. While she enjoys the water typing for defense and has an ability fit for the job in theory, she massively underperforms at the end of the day. And while Armed Forces isn't that outstanding either, at least she may prove annoying enough in case the player doesn't carry some sort of buff control. One big detriment to her ability is her damage increased based on current health, which for one doesn't really specify whether it refers to percentage or numerical. But it's not that noticeable of an increase anyway, unless you really go out of your way to invest in health. Of course, that's on the offensive side, where she can match Harlequin or Toad Warrior in terms of proficiency. Defensively, she has it a little better with the damage reduction per combo hit, but her aging shows, being susceptible to multiple DPS strategies for example. If I were to buff Brain Freeze, I'd start by getting rid of the damage increase with the higher the health, since it didn't do much to begin with, and replacing it with something completely different. Every 10 combo hits, she'll gain 1 stack of Timeless Barrier. It benefits some of the lesser used moves in Cerebella's kit to land extra hits, and it can give her a niche in Rifts as a barrier user, where thanks to her high health, she would be able to take reflect damage from many sources rather nicely. The damage reduction per enemy combo hit, I don't find much reason to change. While it's not perfect and it can also be bypassed, I don't see much need to replace it for, at the very least, being a functional stall. Similar with the previous case, it's often discussed as to who's worse, Private Dick or G.I. Jazz. Well, both of them are big bands, so that already sets a low bar. But I believe Dick has it worse, because Jazz's ability, as terrible as it is, does something unique. Everything Dick has is already taken by multiple other variants that can do his job better, both in stun and resistance. Like anyone else, I believe the problem at large is Big Ben's kit, just relying on stun moves on an offensive side. But there can be good defenders made regardless of poor base kits. Troublemaker being an example example fit for this context. For Private Dig, his main gimmick used to be resisting all debuffs, which was very valuable at the time, but now resistance is commonplace in every fighter, and stun is incredibly frequent with big bands, so at the moment he has nothing to offer. That's why he should take a different approach to his ability, and instead of being a 50% pre-installed resistance, it should be a 50% of converting any debuffs into a barrier. As for the stun, it's difficult. Considering we're working with the original band set, there's already plenty offensive stun as is, so making it defensive like Resonant Evils would be the better choice. Although rather than being exclusively chance based, my take would be making it a reverse fire price fight modifier, where if he suffers about 50% HP in a single hit, he has a 50% chance of inflicting stun. Yes, this makes him killjoy levels of annoying, where it's not difficult but it still gets in the way of a fast kill. But compared to what Band currently has to offer, he can afford more annoying abilities nowadays. Prism Plumage is a variant that has an interesting concept, but her execution leaves a lot to be desired. I would say part of the issue is needing a good team element wise to carry alongside Prism, but Inner Pieces is capable of pulling this off as well, although Eliza's kit is busted as shit, so I digress. Part of the reason she's not as proficient is the teammates tagging with 2 buffs, one of them being fairly practical, while the other is underwhelming by comparison. So the best route to take would be to keep Enrage, Armor, Immunity and Haste, replace the singular regeneration for a heavy regeneration, and remove everything else. But on its place, whenever someone tags in, it gets a buff based on its own element as well as its teammate. Therefore, Fire and Dark gets you Enrage and Haste. As a result, the worth of a tag-in increases somewhat, since the buff gain is furthermore dynamic. The projectile aspect I would keep just the same, but make it available for every teammate. The only change I would do is replace Cripple for Deathmark. Finally, I agree with the retuned document and give Barrier and Hex for neutral teammates or enemies. Raw Nerv's only current redeeming aspect is working as a Tainted Blood user, and even still she's not worth it because of a very limited usability and the existence of better painwheels to make use of Tainted Blood. On an offensive level, the payoff is not worth it outside of maybe the permanent haste, and trying to get about 5 enrage stacks is a recovery dance with outside supports. At least he has easy to acquire prestige due to being price fight reward, and it can be pretty cool to stack guard break, but that's a long-term investment for just an accessible decent prestige. Having said that, I decided to rewatch ZeoW's take on a buff for Raw Nerv, where he proposes she deals full damage against blocking opponents under 50%, and she gains a 15-second final stand at 25. A good proposal, although it's still rooted on the health loss gimmick, and if used offensively with prestige, the first ability would counter the second. Now, while keeping the original health loss aspect, I consider getting rid of the haste and bring back the old quick blockbuster build, except Neuromancer took that spot somewhat. So preferably make it an automatic 5% meter increment, all while under 50%. The 25% mark is much trickier since the payoff really needs to make up for her death. I suggest remove all buffs from the opponent and inflict permanent death mark and a permanent curse. If taken care of first, she would serve as a counter for variants that require specific buffs, and the death mark would still leave extra cheap damage. Regally Blonde shares a very similar ability to another Parasol, no Egrets, but with different activation methods. But there's a key difference here. It just doesn't work all that well with Regally. It inflicts either disable blockbusters, specials, or tag-ins whenever tiers are detonated, already making Napalm trigger a must. You're not required to hit the opponent with the detonations at least, but you still have to repeatedly get rid of the tiers for constant disabling. One extra detail would be the fact that the 3 disables are not inflicted at once, and can potentially overlap each other in procs, so 2 tiers could inflict both disabled tag-ins for example. It's a mess of an ability, and not well supported by the instant blockbuster meter wipe, depending on opponent blockbuster use. Given that Parasols excel much more at offense, I would consider deviating from a defense approach and making the blockbuster wipe activate whenever either fighter uses a blockbuster. Furthermore, detonating at least 1 tier should be enough to disable all 3 attributes at once. An Omni disable by just a single tier may sound overpowered at first, but at the moment there's not a heavy demand for taking care of specials or tag-ins, even if it could help out in combat or for support purposes. N Gloom is potentially the only critical hit based Eliza, due to her access to Deathmark, both a questionable title and something she doesn't do very well to begin with, especially considering the other debuffs in her pool are actually not too bad in Hex, Curse, Wither and Heal Block. The bigger issue is that these 5 debuffs fight against each other to show up whenever a blockbuster is used, and it makes her less practical as a result, even for support role. The solution for this won't need to be of a large scale, since Tomb already benefits from Eliza's excellent base kit, but the best fix would arguably be to have 2 of the 5 debuffs be inflicted at once. It's still random, and the same debuff may try to be applied twice, but this change alone would improve her to a degree. I would also suggest a change for Deathmark, to be replaced with a different type of debuff, but at the same time, if she is to be used as a support, then I can't say I see much need of it. As for the evasion, I see very little reason to touch it. It's currently fine as is, and it can be entertaining.
What the fuck is Stay Hydrated font? I didn't install this.
As much as people shit on Cold Stones due to being overrated by newcomers and other kinds, it's also fair to say he can at least afford to be bad. He's a bronze after all, a means for a starter player to get a quick grip in the beginning, so eventually they can move on to better stuff. Dark Might is not part of this better stuff, kids. The pain of Dark Might has been constant since day 1, having its only selling point of instant kills through tier 3 blockbusters. Needless to say, killing anything with just one move is overpowered as hell, and needs heavy control. It's why Xenomorph's Doom is tied to both requiring a specific transmutation and a 30-second delay. With that, buffing Dark Might should maintain his instant kill condition, but the activation requirements would need to be tweaked for a less messy process. Currently, it asks for the player to be below 50% health, and it has a 1 in 3 chances of activating the instant kill. The chance-based aspect, I think it's okay to keep, even so with its current odds thanks to Beowulf's access to haste, but lowering the health is a condition that needs to be replaced. The solution is honestly as easy as replacing it for hype mode. It's a 10-second window, and you have to make sure your tier 3 is ready to use, all the while you don't sacrifice any health for it. Admittedly, there's already several Beowulfs that make use of hype mode, making the solution a little redundant, but without heavy changes it's likely the best possible solution. As for the damage increase, the best idea I have in mind is to make it more support oriented, where the teammates can also benefit from allies' deaths. Obviously it's still anything but optimal, I mean you have to let your party suffer for the benefit of one, but making it a team-wide effect rather than individual exclusive would make a considerable difference. Besides, All Might did it, so might as well make it again but better. Myst-Match is a definition of counterintuitive. Her ability asks to be on the same element as the opponent, so she can instantly copy any buffs they may gain. I understand why it was done this way, but it works heavily against doubles marquies, let alone doubles transmutation gimmick, since you want to aim for element bonus as often as possible for the extra damage and the chaos marquee. However, because you're also aiming for the enemy element, it becomes a brutally random balancing act. Alternatively, you could go for volatility and reap the benefits of precision every 10 seconds, but the direct benefits are pretty minor. When it comes to a precision user, she's lackluster, but for a silver I guess it's fair enough. Making her much more viable for general use, for me would be as simple as changing the matching element condition for element bonus instead. It's true that the buff copying gimmick would still result underwhelming, but the precision gained out of expired buffs would be put to better use more often, and it would complement the Chaos Marquee much better as a result. She'd still remain a subpar precision user if she were to be considered for rifts, but again I don't think it's too important to focus on that aspect for Myst-Match. Initially I was going to cover Terrorbite, considering her main niche has been overtaken by Blitz and Glamour. But after some reflection, I decided on Purrminator because while her ability is completely functional, it has the weirdest investment conditions. Well, I say weird, but it's not difficult to understand. It's just questionable. Her ability asks of her to land critical hits in order to gain a permanent 3% attack increase, with no limit to how far it can go. But there's a catch, a massive catch that more often than not causes the whole investment an eventual waste of money. The critical hits only acknowledge the base attack for the increase, not the invested attack, meaning that it ends up being a dead stat and you should only build crit rate for her as a means of direct offense. With these hoops in mind, consider this bizarre and unique set and try to apply it to literally any other offensive row of fortune. It just doesn't work. The fix would, in theory, be an easy one. Have the invested attack apply at the same time as the base attack for the ability. That way would considerably speed up the attack increase and make her potentially much more effective and lethal. I'd say it's easy in theory because this is an issue also present among other variants like Flytrap and Jawbreaker, and it hasn't been fixed to this point, either due to being hard to fix or just priorities. Outside of that, really there's not a whole lot I would consider fixing about Purrminator. The precision and deathmark on block are fine as is. She's simply gimped because of a bug that affects her scaling. Many such cases of bugged robos, but I bet all of us are sick of hearing it at this point. Night Terror has a very conflicting ability due to how it asks a distance play in order to gain Miasma, a close distance buff. The problem is obviously not having to keep distance with the opponent. Soul Sister's ability also requests distance, and it can be executed just fine. But on Night Terror's case, the payoff is slow and comparatively less efficient than the likes of Chameleon Twist or even the overrated Vaporwave Vixen. There's also the matter of the fatigue debuff, which all around is a worse version of stun. Its cooldown increase on specials and tag-ins is okay, but nothing to write home about. Some people may consider to just switch positions, and while that would solve the miasma problem, it renders the fatigue 100% useless. Nobody's gonna make use of it on offense, and on the rare occasion Night Terror is seen on a prize fight defense, it's incredibly easy to ignore. So, in an ironic twist, I say keep the miasma game distance-based, but with a catch. Instead of making it 3 seconds of waiting, it needs to be just 1, all while keeping the original duration of 10 seconds for the miasma. This should give enough time to maintain distance through Lobs of Lob and Goodnight Kiss, and stack up to 4 of 5. The fatigue on the other hand proves too weak standalone, so I would suggest complementing it with a second debuff. Something on the lines of Curse could benefit her a fair deal, as means of a buff controller. Of course, by giving it a debuff of that proficiency, it would be fair to keep the default 3-second window for it. As someone who was able to build Starshine early when she came out, I can confidently say she's not the pot of precision at the end of the rainbow we all imagined she would be. You can argue there's other Annies more deserving of a buff than her, but Starshine feels initially made for rifts, only to underperform by the end, which is most unfortunate. The reasons to this are having to wait 30 seconds either at the beginning or on tag-in for the permanent precision to kick in, and being left incredibly vulnerable to buff control or similar. She has access to timeless immunity, but it's furthermore flawed due to also depending on the AI's presence. Suffice it to say, she's poorly optimized for rifts. And yes, it fits for prize fights, but so does Scared Stiff with bullshit levels of investment. And her main problem boils down to how slow she is. That's why I would argue reducing the 30-second timer to just 10 seconds would immediately help her out big time. Additionally, the immunity could be set to spawn in 5 seconds, and both keep the same conditions of being removed when tagging out. That way it evens out by being unable to pass a timeless immunity within her pieces. Granted, a much earlier permanent precision may sound overpowered to some people, but consider the following. First off, 30 seconds is too long of a time, even for permanent precision. And second, Annie's kit is just not suited for Rift battles, even with good moves like Sagan Beam and Destruction Pillar. Similarly, a quick and endless immunity also comes off as busted, but Mummy Dearest currently drives a similar lane. It's not timeless, yeah, but it's as easy as using another Sekhmet Blockbuster, which are ridiculously easy to charge. I get the point that not everything should necessarily be good for that game mode, which is why I didn't cover Firebranded, but again, Starshine feels like she was built for rifts, yet she can't pull through. Plus, she costs more than any of the golds while being jankier to use, so I think it's only fair to focus on her. I genuinely don't get why she wants her so bad. Well, that's about all the changes I can really think of for now anyway. Obviously not all these changes will be agreed upon for whatever reasons, and I'll admit some cases will still remain inefficient and not that worth investing, while other cases could prove potentially too overpowered. And it also goes without saying that these changes are unguaranteed to improve tenfold the variants mentioned. Maybe on a conceptual level it sounds good, but on execution it backfires one way or another. But regardless, I'm interested in seeing if you guys have any other potential buffs for whatever variant comes to mind. Even the ones discussed today. Who knows, getting it out there can have the chance of actually making it into the game. With all that said, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time. Next time being... fuck, I don't know. I think these hiatus are status quo at this point.
Snake, that place is saturated with microwaves. The longer you stay in there, the greater damage you'll take. Get through there as quickly as possible.